Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining today. I'm Randy Ruta, National Health Council Chief Executive Officer, and I am excited to welcome you to our webinar, the National Health Council's Patient Experience Mapping Toolbox, an introduction and potential applications. And during today's webinar, you'll learn about the development of a set of tools for researchers to engage patients to gather high-quality data about their experiences, priorities, and desired outcomes as they navigate the health ecosystem to best manage their health. We believe that a standardized approach will make it easier for researchers to apply patient insights. We invite your feedback on this resource, your experience with the toolbox, ideas for future uses, and recommendations on how we could potentially adapt it. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Orlean, the National Health Council's Assistant Vice President of Research and Programs, and really our patient experience mapping champion. She is joined by a distinguished panel of experts, all part of the National Health Council family, who partnered with us on this strategic resource. Thank you all for your hard work and leadership. And so with that, Elizabeth, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Randy. I appreciate it. And certainly I'm joined by other champions on this call of the Patient Experience Mapping Toolbox. And we're so excited to make more champions of the toolbox during today's call. So let's go to the next slide, please. I wanted to get started with just a couple of housekeeping items. So first of all, the webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the NHC's website afterwards. All attendees are automatically muted and you won't be able to unmute yourself, but we do welcome you to submit questions through the Q&A function. And we'll have some time at the end to go through those. And certainly this is just the first engagement on this topic. So there'll be plenty of future opportunities to have Q&A as well. Can go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to get started by acknowledging all of the people who made this possible. First of all, our supporters, which are listed on the left-hand side. It wouldn't have been possible without their support. And then our advisory board members. And we truly have an incredible advisory board on this project. And their names are listed here. Certainly feel free to reach out to any of them. They've been very engaged in the development of these resources. And then next of all, certainly to the project team who have been instrumental in doing the work to get the resource together. And in particular, I want to acknowledge Silka Shah, who's the manager of research and programs at the NHC. Can go to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to do real brief introductions because we've got a lot of content to cover. So we are joined today by three of our advisory board members. First of all, Stacy Bell, who's the Executive Vice President at Opsis Health and the Global Nutrition Project. And she served as Chief Scientific and Medical Officer of the National Psoriasis Foundation as we were completing this work. And then I'm also joined by Noel McElwee, who is the Vice President of Health Economics and Outcomes Research at Boehringer Ingelheim. And then we're joined by Rachel Duncan, who's the Director at Academy Health. So you'll be hearing from each of them from their unique perspectives about how can the information gathered through applying the patient experience be used in the patient community, in industry, and then also by health services researchers and other academic researchers as well. So next slide, please. I will turn it over to Dr. Stacy Bell. Stacy.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you to the National Health Council for allowing us to all be here today and to share our work and our collaboration for the Patient Experience Mapping Toolkit. It was a phenomenal group of individuals, and I think that this will be such a valuable asset for our community. So if you go to the next slide, please. So when we are all in these webinars now, and we spend so much time on Zoom, I think it's really important at the very beginning to think about the objectives of the webinar, the time we're spending together. This webinar today is intended to provide an introduction to patient experience mapping for researchers and key stakeholders to provide support for our patients in our efforts of research and in advocacy. Through the years of doing research for myself and thinking about the patient experience, oftentimes it was thought of as a journey from point A to point B. And I think that what we all learned as an advisory committee and what you'll learn today is it's much more involved than that. And so we really are now terming it a patient experience. With that, this webinar will also encompass an introduction to the patient experience mapping toolkit that was developed by this group. This toolkit includes multiple tools, all of which are available free for public use, which I think is a very unique opportunity as well. And I would encourage at the end of this webinar to really consider how this toolkit can be applied to your work. And don't hesitate, as Randy mentioned, as Elizabeth mentioned, to reach out to anyone on the advisory committee to assist with that. And then finally, this effort does represent a collaboration between many organizations and individuals with varied experience, different stakeholders considering different perspectives in the patient journey in overall healthcare and in policy. And so with that, I hope you see when you hear about the toolkit that those different perspectives were represented. So what will you learn, or what do you hope to learn from this webinar? Really, the big thing that we hope to accomplish today is how these tools can be applied or adapted by researchers to understand chronic diseases, the patient experiences of those living with them before diagnosis, after receiving their diagnosis, and then, kind of the experience of that diagnosis in and of itself. And then secondly, how these outputs can be applied to enhance patient centricity and clinical research, and importantly, care delivery or the decisions being made for the patients. So if we go to the next slide, okay, excellent. So when we think about experiences, each of us have our own unique experiences, places we've traveled, individuals we've met along the way, many adventures, often hardships, unfortunately, and many triumphs. So, experiences in health and wellness are no different. And they're equally unique for each individual. So some are impacted by lifestyle choices, some may be impacted by access to care, education, geographical location, nutrition, and of course, their family history and just their disease and what they're experiencing uniquely as an individual themselves with that. I always think about this. I grew up in North Dakota and in a rural area and didn't really at the time think about healthcare because for me, we were very fortunate, to really only need our primary visits and that type of thing. But now after working with a number of patients, those simple things as far as even a geographical location can make such a difference. And just like our phases in life too, there are also stages in health and wellness and the experiences associated with it. So as I mentioned previously, acquiring a diagnosis, trying to come up with a treatment plan, and then maintaining that. And each of us also, as we go through life, will have other factors, aging, hormones, life experiences that impact that journey that we're on. So if we go to the next slide, please. So every patient experience is unique. Oftentimes it's nonlinear. I think that's the one thing with the toolkit that all of us, I think, can comment on. Again, initially we thought about it being a journey from point A to point B. And what we determined is really that's something that there are detours along that path. Sometimes there are returning back on the same route and going forward again, hopefully with, using a different street per se, using the map as an analogy there. But I think that, with that nonlinear consideration, other elements need to be factored in when you're thinking about the patient experience. I was very fortunate to serve as the Chief Scientific and Medical Officer at the National Psoriasis Foundation. I'm going to be sharing some of the data from the NPF today. Fantastic organization as are the partners within the National Health Council. But during my time there, I was able to hear a multitude of patient stories. I'm going to share an example from the psoriatic disease community shortly, but I think if each of you think about the patients within your sphere of influence, each are going to have their unique story and each are going to have something that is a consideration for them. And so as you can imagine, to develop a patient experience mapping toolkit, it was an involved process, not perfect, but I think something that really can be helpful in understanding that. Understanding these experiences will result in a greater understanding of the disease process, hopefully an earlier diagnosis in many cases, better treatment plans, and then ultimately improved outcomes. And then ideally from a policy standpoint too, less economic burden and greater access to care. So if we go to the next slide. As I mentioned, I wanted to share some of the fantastic data from the National Psoriasis Foundation. A big thank you to that group for allowing us to include these data today. thinking about the experience that someone that has psoriatic arthritis really made me think about the mapping exercise itself. The difficulty with psoriatic arthritis is there's not presently a clinical diagnostic test available for PSA. And because of that, oftentimes the diagnosis happens by a process of elimination. The challenge is that delaying a diagnosis by as little as 6 months can result in permanent joint damage for these individuals. You couple that with an ongoing rheumatology shortage, and you can imagine that that's even more challenging. In addition, even though there's been a wealth of new treatments for psoriasis and also approvals for psoriatic arthritis, there's still about 60% of the patients that remain dissatisfied with their treatment. So when you're thinking about their experience, all these things will potentially factor in. In addition, for psoriatic arthritis and psoriasis, as well as many other conditions, there's oftentimes multiple comorbidities associated. And so I think, again, that factors into when you're thinking about the overall patient experience. On the right-hand side of this slide, it shows some data from the National Psoriasis Foundation annual survey for 2020. George Gondo has spearheaded this work and has done a phenomenal job capturing the patient experience in many facets of their day-to-day life. But in this case, it shows those individuals that have a time between the initial symptoms and diagnosis. And you can see that there's still a significant percentage that are more than 3 years of diagnosis until their formal diagnosis. And so thinking about all these elements and patient experience for this specific community, really makes a big difference in how we think about developing a diagnostic tool and how individuals are seen by their dermatologists and rheumatologists. We go to the next slide, please. So, when you're thinking about developing tools to capture the patient experience or even patient-reported outcomes, there are a number of really great tools out there, but the difficulty is many of them often are specific to the purpose of use, and they don't really capture that lived experience, either over time or, again, this road going forward and back, or possibly having detours. So in clinical trials, there's patient-reported outcomes. In clinical care, there's clinical objective measures, many subjective measures, but they don't really always capture the impact on day-to-day life. And they don't usually factor in access to care considerations along the way, or maybe even, like I use the psoriatic arthritis example, being able to find the physician to actually help them or the provider to help them. Getting patient input is key along this mapping tool process, and being able to do that at multiple touch points such that there's confidence and that you really truly are capturing what the patient is experiencing. There also needs to be utility across many phases of the journey, as I mentioned, whether that be in stages of life or stages of the disease process. And finally, any tool that's being developed really should have that patient centricity and really be able to incorporate elements of personalized medicine. So with that, I'm excited to turn it back to Elizabeth and have her talk a little bit about the toolkit that's been developed.
Great. Thanks so much, Stacy. Well, so now let's hear a little bit more, just building off of what Stacy had already mentioned, in the context of what sort of the terminology that we often use, especially when we're talking about drug development, patient experience data. So, we're all interested in collecting representative patient experience data, which are intended to provide information about patients' experiences with a disease or condition. And that can include the impacts, including both physical and psychosocial impacts of a disease, as well as patient preferences with respect to treatment of the disease or condition. And so what we wanted to develop was a set of resources that could be used across chronic conditions in order to engage and document patients' experiences before getting a diagnosis, while getting a diagnosis, and then ultimately living with a diagnosis. And so this is where we landed, and over the coming slides, I'll provide a little bit more about what these individual pieces are and how we got there. So if you go onto our website, you can see the patient experience mapping toolbox, and that includes project planning guides, and that's intended for folks who want to apply the toolbox for a specific reason, whether that's engaging patients in a specific disease or whether it's engaging people with different chronic diseases, but on a specific topic to learn about some type of a study objective. Now we've developed data collection tools, and I'll walk through these. This includes a plain language consent form, an interview guide template, as well as a visual that's intended to be used with patients as you're interviewing them as part of a patient experience mapping exercise. And so this is how we got here. So over the past 2 years, our advisory board has worked really closely together on going through each of these phases. And it was really important to us that we followed a rigorous process and really thought about this from a researcher point of view. Is we want to make sure that this is a comprehensive interview guide, that these interview questions are high quality, that they're understandable to patients, and that it's delivering to us the kind of information that's useful and that matters to individual patients. So we started off with a lit review where we looked at what are the different patient experience maps that are out there, patient journey maps, conceptual models, and other related resources. And what is it that we can borrow from those resources? And then what are the concepts of patient experiences that are useful for us to use as we're starting to outline a framework for an interview guide, as well as a visual that we wanted to develop, really a conceptual model of patient experiences. So we agreed that it would include those individual components that I showed on the previous slide. We went and got IRB approval to develop this. We were, going to conduct interviews, engage patients as part of this process. So based off of the lit review, based off of prior research, and then based off of a series of meetings that we had among members of the ad board, we developed a set of initial draft resources. And then we sent the patient-facing tools, so that would include the consent form, the draft interview guide template, as well as the visual, over to a group of experts in health literacy and asked them to review them, make edits to ensure that the material that we were presenting was plain language, that it was sensitive to cultures, it was anything where there was potentially numeracy in place, that all of those things were being considered. And so we were really, very pleased with what they sent back to us as a starting point. But certainly the next phase of it is testing it out with patients to make sure that, that it truly is understandable. So as an initial phase, we did cognitive interviews. And basically what that means is that we ask individuals, in this case, individuals diagnosed with the chronic disease, to walk us through what they were seeing and explain to us how they were interpreting and what was in the map and the different language that was listed on there. And so we got some really valuable feedback, made some edits to it. And then we conducted pilot interviews with individuals in the United States who self-reported that they were diagnosed with a chronic disease. In most cases, they had multiple chronic conditions. And it was for this phase, we really strived for diversity, because the effort here that we're trying to show here, and the purpose of these interviews, is we wanted to make sure that as we're developing a disease agnostic interview guide that can be modified to be applicable to a range of different applications, that we had a breadth of questions that would actually probe at the different aspects of different patient experiences. And then it's ultimately going to be up to the researcher to decide which of these questions is appropriate given the disease population and the study objective. But we want to make sure that the interview guide template has the sample questions so that folks can choose among those. So we iterated, we met regularly with the ad board to talk about what some of the changes were going to be based off of what we were experiencing with the interviews. For example, we added some additional questions about people who were diagnosed at birth and certainly wouldn't be able to talk about the real early phases of their diagnosis, but might be able, in some cases, even to talk about their children's experiences with that same chronic condition. And so those are listed in there. And what we're presenting today is version 1 of the toolbox. And, certainly there'll be future iterations of the toolbox based off of the community's experience applying it. And so we will definitely be looking for partners in order to pilot test the toolbox and adapt it potentially for acute conditions, potentially into other languages as well. And so Here's what you can see on the website. We've got a number of resources, project planning resources. And so to clarify, the toolbox can be used by all the different groups represented on this call. That includes patient groups who are interested in engaging patients in their constituents, for industry, which are always developing patient journey maps for their own work, and then for others maybe interested in applying for PCORI funding or something. But we wanted to provide resources to help individuals interested in applying the tools to understand some of the frequently asked questions. What are things that the interviewer who's facilitating interviews should know? And then also we have our patient engagement fair market value calculator, which is a good guide because certainly at the National Health Council, we believe it's important to compensate patients also for their participation in these exercises. And so that can help you in terms of budgeting. So we do provide these. Certainly we recommend that you work with a qualified experienced researcher as you're applying them because it is human subjects research. And then here is just an overview of the data collection tools, and we'll walk through each of these one by one. But we've got the consent sheet template, which is of course something that can be used in order to gain informed consent. People agree to the potential benefits and potential risks of participating in an interview. And that's been reviewed for health literacy as well. Then we've got the interview guide template. And again, this is a collection of questions. And so you can modify it based on your unique study objective. And then we've got a visual, which I'll be showing in a second. And so here you can see the consent sheet template. And this is intended to be used as part of the patient experience mapping toolbox. Certainly it has applications to other qualitative research. You can download this from our website, and you're welcome to modify it based on your particular study objective. It's really sort of the nuts and bolts. What do people need to know? And gets rid of some of these ways that we as researchers might frame something that don't necessarily make sense to patients. So one example is at the beginning, we had framed this as you're being asked to participate in this study. And so, working with folks who are experts in health literacy, they pointed out to us, well, the individuals think they're participating in an interview, and they may think a study is a clinical trial or something like that, and you're not asking them to participate in that. And so we've really thought very carefully about all of those potential barriers to participation as we've been developing this consent sheet template. And so that's one of the resources that's included. Next, we have here's sort of the two primary sources for collecting data. So you can see on the left-hand side is our patient experience map, and this is a little bit different than conventionally what you might think of as a patient experience map, which would be depicting a specific disease experience, where it would be potentially common things that happen during people with a chronic conditions experience. And it might be disease specific. This is much higher. This is more of a conceptual model that walks you through life before getting a diagnosis, and then living with a diagnosis, and all of these potential challenges that happen along the way. And the idea here is that the individual who's being interviewed can look at something as they're being interviewed and think about, oh yeah, how did my insurance and access to care, how did that impact my early decision in order to actually go see a healthcare provider? Or perhaps how did finances or other costs impact my decisions along the way, or family support system, and so on and so forth. So that's another resource, and it's aligned exactly with the interview guide template, and so they're intended to be used together. So you can see here just an example of how you use them together. This is from the right-hand island, which is living with a diagnosis, and so you can see here's just a screenshot of a small piece of the interview guide template where we've got sample language for folks to use. We've bolded what we think should be queried consistently across chronic diseases when you're applying the toolbox. And then we have unbolded questions that we think are important questions, but may or may not be relevant. Certainly this can be adapted based off of your needs, but this is just a little bit of an example for how the map aligns with the interview guide template. And so now, just briefly, I wanted to also provide some information. We've mentioned a couple of times that you can modify this based off of your study objective, but what kind of information can you get from this? And so these are the headers that are included in the interview guide, and you can see how it aligns with the map. But just examples of the type of information that you would be able to collect and potential applications. You'll be hearing about some of them, but there's questions about care coordination. That certainly has implications for quality improvement or care delivery improvement. We've got a section on quality measurement, genetic testing, experiences with surgeries, treatments that they tried and stopped. And we've embedded within the interview guide all of the patient-focused drug development questions that that folks will be interested in our membership, certainly in gathering data on as well. So I am going to just review here just some next steps and partnership opportunities. At the NHC, we're certainly very dedicated to moving this forward along with the ad board members and others. And so we're looking for partners who are interested in working with us to apply the toolbox to a particular topic, people who are interested in pilot testing it in a specific disease, adapting it to acute conditions, testing it with individuals who have acute conditions, and then potentially also language and cultural adaptation. So feel free to send me a note if you were interested in partnering on any of those types of activities. And now I will turn it over to Newell.
Unmute myself there. Thank you. So good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone, wherever you're calling in from. I'm Newell McElwee, and I've had the very good fortune of being able to work with Elizabeth and the National Health Council on this project. And today I'd like to address 4 key questions. The first is there a need for a standardized approach? The second is, how has pharma used patient experience? The third is, can patient experience inform HTA and regulatory decisions on healthcare technologies? And then finally, can the NHC guide advance the science, if you will, of patient experience? So let's get started. So the first question is whether we need a standard approach. And a good starting point is what we call it. We first started with patient journey. Many of you have heard that term before, but we later switched to patient experience based on patient feedback. But there are many other terms that are used, and they're used interchangeably, and I'll just give you a few. So there's patient experience, patient journey, patient perspective, patient perception, patient mapping, patient satisfaction, patient reports, patient flow. So a lot of different terms that are used. The definitions also vary considerably. So for example, one recent paper described patient experience as, and I'll just read this to you, a sequence of electronic health records over time that is organized at multiple levels, patients, visits, and medical codes. So this is an example of using healthcare data to define the experience, but not really the holistic experience of the patient. So that leads to the context of all of this, and whether the experience is holistic, that is a health experience, or represents the health care experience. And for most patients, only a small proportion of their health experience is in a healthcare setting. So that's why we think it's really important to capture the entire holistic experience. And finally, what does the literature look like? I would say, in short, it's very messy for all of the reasons that I just described above. So all of these things together really argue for a standard approach to assessing patient experience. So now let's talk about patient experience in the pharmaceutical industry. So I think we would all agree that historically we haven't always put patients at the center, even when we thought we were doing it. So now there's, I think, a lot more recognition by all stakeholders that we must do this. including drug companies, payers, and regulatory agencies. And I think we've really made significant progress in the past few years. So patient experience is now a critical part of drug development programs. Regulatory agencies like the FDA now require patient-focused drug development. And this has implications for everything from really more carefully defining the study endpoints that are relevant to patients, to dosing regimens, to even pill size. And then marketing groups also use patient experience information to develop patient support programs. And HUR and medical groups use patient experience to supplement what they know about from real-world data on healthcare experience. But there are some methodologic challenges with patient experience data. So the first is representativeness. We don't typically have random samples when we do this kind of work. So we just need to be thoughtful about ensuring that patients provide patient experience data that represents the target population. And then there's also recall bias, because remember, we're capturing data over an entire sort of life cycle of a patient's disease, even pre-diagnosis. And that memory is impacted by time decay and saliency of the event. So the nuances of getting a diagnosis may not be recalled after a few years. We need to consider recall bias as one of our methodologic challenges. And then finally, there's just generalizability, and I'll talk about that specifically in relation to the tool that was developed. So the NHC guide was developed in English for a US population. So other languages, other health systems, other cultures will need to be studied going forward. And then finally on this slide, I'd just like to describe an approach that has been used at my company, where we created, and this was to address the issue of recall bias. So we created virtual online cohort communities that were grouped by time since diagnosis. So each of those categories that you heard previously mentioned, we had a specific cohort for that. And the patients in the online communities interacted with each other over time, and that was for a few weeks in this online community to provide feedback. And this holistic approach sort of covered pre-diagnosis, diagnosis, treatment, monitoring, and even what they thought their future state might be. So now let's move on to HTA decisions. So the world that I live in is mostly around adoption and diffusion decisions by value assessment entities like HTA agencies and their clients who are payers and healthcare delivery systems. So that kind of begs the question, can patient experience input inform these decisions? So I feel obligated to start with the single patient input. In the very early days, that's really how it started. It started with NICE in the UK having a single patient representing all diseases. And then more recently, we've moved to having patients with the disease and a disease-specific role helping inform the adoption diffusion decisions. These are all small steps in the right direction, but still only one patient and don't represent the kind of patient experience data that we're talking about here. So what about HTA agency use of patient-reported outcome data and decision-making? So the experience has mostly been that it's acceptable for kind of what I would call regulatory agency quality data, but not so much for patient self-generated data. That's an area that I think we need more work in. But patient groups themselves have demonstrated that they can generate high-quality evidence. And one example of that is from the patient-led research collaborative. This was led by Hannah Davis and 4 other women with long COVID syndrome. All are legitimate RWE scientists in their own right. And their results from their studies are now being used by government agencies like the CDC and have been published in key journals. So the final question here is, how should HTA agencies define value? This has been best defined, in my opinion, by Michael Porter from Harvard Business School in his New England Journal paper, where he defines it as value to patients. And I'll quote one thing from the paper. It says, high value for patients must become the overarching goal. So I think this calls for better patient experience data to be used in this assessment. So in conclusion, for this slide, we have increasing and substantial evidence that understanding patient experience can benefit HTA decisions and help inform adoption diffusion decisions. So if we could go to the final slide. So this is my fourth question. Can the patient experience guide advance the science in this arena? I believe that it does for the following reasons. It's the first patient experience tool that has been developed by patients themselves. And that, I think, just really brings a new perspective. It also takes a comprehensive approach, as you've heard Elizabeth describe, of excuse me, developing and testing interview questions, ensuring that plain language is used through health literacy testing, and extensive interviewing training and resources. And it also addresses some of the scientific rigor concerns raised by HTA agencies on the use of self-reported patient data in their assessments. However, I think we also recognize that going forward, it will be a learning process. I believe Stacy also mentioned that, and further refinements will be made along the way as we put this into use, including some of the pilot studies. So this will be a learning process for us. So now I'd like to turn it over to Rachel Duncan from Academy Health for the next presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for being here. I'm very excited to join my other colleagues in celebrating the launch of this newly developed suite of products. By way of quick introduction, I'm Rachel Duncan. I currently serve as a director at Academy Health, where my portfolio broadly focuses on studying and promoting both patient-centered care and patient-engaged research. And among other things, I work on projects advancing patient-centered approaches to clinical decision support and also enhancing the integration of patient-reported or patient-generated data with other clinical data sources. And while I'm not able to speak on behalf of Academy Health, I can say that my work connects me to diverse collaborators and stakeholders in the fields of health research, policy, and practice. But separately, I also myself have a rare chronic condition, and I serve as a patient advocate in the vision research community, which brings me to my first point on the next slide. So when we think about what makes this particular toolkit distinctive, what adds value to the field in a new way, I think that one of the distinguishing factors really is in its design. You've heard a bit about this already. As someone who identifies both as a patient and a health services research professional, I was really struck by the diversity of professional and personal vantage points reflected on the advisory board. And similarly, while the sample was somewhat small, it was also notably diverse, which supported what I feel is a truly robust process. And then finally, by demonstrating responsiveness to both advisory board members and informants' input, I think the National Health Council team fostered a process that, while rooted in rigorous methods, was also truly engaged and very collaborative. Next slide. As a result, the products emerging from this process feel almost inherently accessible for diverse audiences and useful for addressing diverse needs. And the question we might ask here is why does that matter? I think sometimes we take for granted that that's important, but why is it especially crucial that this toolbox be equipped to benefit or support diverse end users? And it seems a bit self-explanatory, but we'll think through it aloud. Next slide. Patient journeys, as Stacy referred to, are often perceived, at least in theory, as being somewhat linear, and they're often interrogated in a strictly clinical sense. So clinicians will identify a solution for a strictly clinical problem. For individuals with chronic conditions, however, the equation isn't that simple. So using this visual, if you pull the red thread here and you try to address that problem first to kind of tease out that thread, isolate that variable, or identify that diagnosis, you might have some luck. The same applies if you try to pull the green thread here, but if you try to pull them both at the same time, you're really likely to just tighten this knot, if you will, to make it more difficult to tease those things apart and to identify a particular diagnosis or a particular reaction to a certain condition. And so treating complex or confounding conditions really requires having a process or system that is inherently designed to handle that complexity. Next slide. I'm sure a lot of folks on this call recognize that chronic conditions are sustained, which also means they're lived and experienced by patients in many settings and at many stages over the life course. And having multiple chronic conditions can further amplify the challenges presented by each condition in isolation. And then finally, we also know that overlapping symptoms from those multiple chronic conditions can actually obscure or confound attempts to achieve or remedy a diagnosis. So moving to the next slide, I'm going to pull back up the map and give you a quick example of an instance where using this map could add distinct value add in a patient conversation. So upwards of about 30% of individuals with Down syndrome are also eventually diagnosed with the vision condition that I have. It's called keratoconus, or KC. And one KC caregiver told me about her niece with Down syndrome, whose communication skills were somewhat limited, which sometimes made clinical conversations a bit difficult. But at some point, she reported emergent challenges, and her care providers wrote off her concerns as being associated with either cognitive impairment or with depression. And they ultimately prescribed heavy antidepressants, which she had a violently negative reaction to. And it was only after that reaction and years of rethinking and reassessment that doctors realized that what was declining was her vision and not her mental health. So in this case, one diagnosis, her Down syndrome diagnosis, had been used to effectively explain away a problem that was pointing to a second condition for which she desperately needed a second diagnosis so she could access the appropriate vision care. And I think this is a perfect example of a scenario in which a tool like this map can be used to facilitate discussion and data collection about a fairly complicated patient experience. So revisiting the red and green threads example, if we were using a Down syndrome map or a keratoconus map to generate accurate data about her experience, we might have some success, but it really would have been quite difficult, if not impossible, to assess her true comprehensive state of health without a map that accounts for the intersection of those two pathways. And I think by prompting people to consider the way that clinical health intersects with so many other contextual factors, this map can scaffold more complex conversations, solicit more detailed and deep information about people's experience of health and healthcare. And I think these complex conversations are going to increasingly become the norm, especially given the prevalence of multiple chronic conditions, which has drawn the attention of many funders, as has actually the growing awareness and acceptance that in order to be effective, health research, policy, and practice decisions must necessarily take into account the perspectives of affected people. Next slide. And to that end, there's a whole rapidly growing body of evidence that demonstrates the benefits of involving patients and other stakeholders in healthcare and health research. At very least, it demonstrates the benefits of soliciting patient and stakeholder input. And a lot of this evidence suggests that the use of patient-centered or patient-informed approaches can in fact increase the rigor and the quality of health research, as well as the reach and impact of programmatic work. And as this evidence surfaces, funders actually have begun to embrace and even mandate the use of tools and practices that center patients' experiences, starting to recognize the contributions of context experts, or people who are experts in their own body, their own condition, or culture, or community, or context, as being equal to the contributions of content experts or subject matter experts. Next slide. And in messages from funders who have begun to champion and in some cases preferentially support applicants demonstrating commitment to patient-centered or patient-engaged approaches, you'll start to see references celebrating diverse perspectives, celebrating the importance of building patients' and communities' trust. And on the next slide, also a recognition that our complex work requires, in fact, necessitates input from multiple types of contributors. Next slide. Those are just two of many funders, as you see here, already signaling their valuation or prioritization of patient or person-centered efforts. And for me, this is a pretty powerful indicator that the field is increasingly adopting and embracing these approaches, and that researchers in academic and nonprofit settings can really benefit from aligning themselves with this shift. Next slide. So again, thinking about the distinct value add of this toolbox, which offers both project planning and data collection resources, I would suggest that its use can really enhance or advance researchers' work in 3 main ways. Next slide. First, I think the toolbox provides the means for gleaning more accurate patient experience information. And perhaps that information can be used to support a membership needs assessment, or to indicate patient preferences, or assess the priorities of a target audience. Perhaps information generated using this toolbox can inform the design and development of a trial or of a treatment solution. And in fact, perhaps those processes of informed design can increase adherence to that treatment protocol or decrease attrition during a study. And of course, all of these small shifts contribute to longer term benefits for organizations and institutions, which are kind of highlighted at the bottom of this slide. Next slide. Second, the toolbox resources can support training and education by helping to build capacity and self-efficacy for non-traditional research partners, and also by increasing trust via the provision of better informed care. But the resources can also provide support to clinical, academic, research, and project staff, offering guides for navigating these tough patient experience conversations and for conducting coordinated and consistent activities while dealing with fairly dynamic content. All of this enhances teams' abilities to be responsive, both attitudinally and methodologically, to calls from the field for increased patient-centeredness. Next slide. And then finally, I think patient experience information can help research and programmatic professionals to better understand the realities of their stakeholders. And as a result, they can tailor their work and their research products to best respond to those realities, remaining relevant to people's real-world experiences and presenting findings or solutions that resonate in order to really meet the needs of those audiences or meet them where they are. And in these ways and so many others, I think using the toolbox can support organizations and institutions in their efforts to align themselves with these values, increasingly upheld by funders, and potentially thereby increase their eligibility for funding. I think these tools can support organizations in achieving targets and providing real benefit to their members, partners, or even research end users. Again, ultimately increasing the impact of the dollars, time, and effort spent on research and programmatic activities. And then finally, for me, I think what's really important here is this incredible opportunity we have to get at the truth of patient experiences, to finally be able to create more accurate, more robust, and better informed data sets that can be used to create systems really equipped to recognize and respond to real-world patient needs and experiences. And I think that the National Health Council team and members of the advisory board took a very thoughtful and also rigorous and intentional approach to creating these resources. As a result, the toolbox, in my opinion, can be adapted for use in a lot of different settings to support various forms of what we hope will be progress for the field. So with that, I will pass it back to Elizabeth.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And citations here. Now we have some time to actually do Q&A. So I'm going to get rid of the slides so that I can take a look at the Zoom and see if any questions have come in yet. And in the meantime, feel free if you've got a question and want to ask it to put it into the Q&A function, and we'll be happy to do so. Okay, I see actually the first question is, I have a question on the makeup of the ad board. Was the board comprised of diverse members in terms of ancestry, age, geographic location, etc.? So I guess that there's two different pieces here. There's the question about the advisory board and who was on the ad board. And then the second layer of that is who was this tested with? And so I think, you're welcome to take a look on the website. We've got all the ad board members listed, but it was quite deliberate in, first of all, so certainly there are folks who expressed an interest and came to us and were very interested in this topic. And so of course we wanted them to participate in the ad board, and many of them are experts either in patient engagement or in one of the applications, and that's why they were interested in the topic in the first place. We also were very deliberate in engaging individuals on the ad board also who are patients and who may or may not have any research experience, to make sure that we were bringing that perspective in. And then we also went to experts who may not even have been in the NHC membership, but who are experts in this, perhaps qualitative research or in patient-centered outcomes research, and then made sure that they were able to contribute. And then the second layer of the question would be about who we tested it with. And we, are happy to share the table. It'll be in a forthcoming publication, but it was a remarkably, it was very deliberate, the sampling. We wanted to get as diverse of a sample as we could within our constraints, which was, we budgeted for these 35 interviews as part of the initial step. And so we were we had a list, we based it off of the chronic condition warehouse chronic condition list, and we tried to make sure that we were hitting as many of those chronic conditions as possible while paying attention to individuals' insurance status, also education and other socio-demographic characteristics. So happy to have other ad board members address that topic as well.
So I think, Elizabeth, I commented in writing back to that question. I think that we were very fortunate to have a number of individuals on the advisory board, comment on their varied experiences. And I think that within the ad board itself, and even looking at the presenters today, if you look at the different perspectives that myself, Newell, and Rachel brought to the group, and the individuals we represent, I think that in and of itself, obviously the advisory board was a small number, as were those that we tested on, but I think we represented quite a diverse swath of both patients and patient advocates in that setting. And I think that somewhat plays into the next question too, about how did we consider those that had multiple chronic conditions? I think that's really what shaped the formation of the map, and also some of the questions and everything else, is that we actually were trying to encompass the entire experience that individual may have. So even if they had psoriasis and they had clear skin, what about their mental health? What about their psoriatic arthritis? And you could go to a variety of other therapeutic areas, and I think discern the same. And I think those individuals really added texture and complexity and depth to the toolkit.
Absolutely. Okay, so one of the other questions is, when you were testing the toolbox, how did you account for patients with multiple chronic conditions? So in this particular, in the pilot testing that we did at this stage, we actually invited the individual to choose sort of a primary diagnosis, and then to talk about how did the other chronic conditions impact that particular sort of primary diagnosis. And so we thought that that was really the best way to do this, because it was most closely linked to how we anticipate that this would be applied in a disease-specific way in the future, while still, understanding the complexities of how multiple chronic conditions interplay amongst themselves. So that's how we handled that here. And then one question maybe for the group is, are there ideal targets or qualities for pilot testing that you can share with those that may be considering how to apply these tools? So I am happy to, start off with my perspective, and then I know we've talked amongst the ad board about what some of the potential pilot testing might look like. I think, some of the things we've talked about is we definitely want to do a rare disease to see how does this work in a rare disease. We're interested in testing it among, I'm trying to think, we've got a list of the potential ones. We want to test it for different study objectives. So for example, maybe the objective is around identifying barriers to access to care or something like that. And that would be an opportunity for us to understand across chronic conditions, what are some of the opportunities out there for us to make improvements? And I know that this is a topic that Randy is really interested in us applying the toolbox. So Randy, if you wanted to comment on that as well.
Well, I think that's just going to be a critical space for us to really see how can we take, as still part of this research process, the tools as they are right now and have those pilots. It really would help us understand for those different populations how it works and what the nuances might be and how that could inform how we take it forward. And then actually I'm open to, and Elizabeth and I have talked about this, are there opportunities for us right now, even as we're still completing that arc of research and being very disciplined about it, to start to engage in various forums with various kinds of patient groups and others, the use of this tool to actually kind of use a real world evidence or pragmatic approach to start to, broaden our understanding about how it's useful, what kinds of things should we think about, and then kind of create some synergy between our continuation of a very carefully disciplined research process, as well as some of those very practical in the trenches experiences.
Well, and I think, Randy, what I would add to that as well is that one of the things we talked about in the development of the toolbox, and I think all of us have acknowledged today, it is a work in progress, right? This was developed for chronic conditions. We've had a number of questions about acute conditions as well. And if we think about even the reporting that we hope to do or the supporting information for the toolbox, or the toolkit, we've talked about, the potential limitations and caveats and next steps, quite frankly.
Right.
But what I would encourage individuals when they're saying, what targets or what qualities, think about what you want to accomplish at the end. If you want specific information to support drug development, if you're in, the biotech or pharma industry, or to support policy measures, those are then some of the individuals you'll want to bring in to answer those specific questions. And that's the other great thing about the toolkit, is that it has the adaptability and the scope to really encompass all those different elements for those living with chronic conditions. So, I think start at the end and work backward, and that'll help you pick some of those participants.
Then one question from Allison is about if we can speak a little bit about the elements of the toolbox that account for the patient experience in the time before seeking care. For example, symptoms have appeared, but there is a delay in seeking care. So you're welcome. If you go onto the Toolbox website, we can, post the link in the chat. You can actually see a sample of the interview guide and take a look at each of those individual questions, and that's for planning purposes. And then you can just shoot us an email, and then we have some questions just to make sure that we're capturing lessons learned also as people are applying the toolbox. And so just shoot us an email, and we can, talk more about applying it. But some of the items that we're thinking about in that particular piece of it, information gathering, where did people go for, did they go on WebMD and that was their primary source? Did they go to a patient group? Did they go to Facebook? Where is it that people are looking for information, and how did that impact where they started their care journey, delays, facilitators of entering the care or the healthcare system, also lifestyle changes. So those are some examples. And then I see that we're just about at time. So I would suggest, send an email. I think this is just our first engagement. We've talked about potentially bringing together all of the ad board members just for an open discussion and Q&A with folks who are interested in using this. And so there will definitely be plenty of opportunities for further discussion, but certainly in the meantime, feel free to email us if you're interested. Go onto the website, poke around. Silke just posted it into the chat, and reach out with any questions. We'll be very excited to talk to you.
So Elizabeth, there's one more question that came in about where the qualitative patient experience data could potentially be published. The one thing I'd like to comment on there briefly is I think that you'll see a greater increase of acceptance of patient experience data. And, I would say within your specific therapeutic area, really look at the trend of that within the journals that you may be publishing in. I think also, some of the larger, like JAMA and things like that are beginning to include them. I think that Newell and Rachel did a fantastic job highlighting where patient experience data is rising to the top, whether it be with policy or even with the new PDUFA or with FDA, and then also from funding, as Rachel indicated. So I think that will also be reflected in publication. But we can, in the follow-on with the advisory board, I think the advisory board members can share specific examples of journals that we went to as well.
Great. Well, thank you, Stacy, and thanks everybody for joining us. We're really excited to put this out into the world, hear feedback, and see where it takes us.
Really, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Newell, Rachel, Elizabeth, and Stacy. Absolutely fantastic discussion today. I'm really excited to see how we can continue to refine and, as I say, in a disciplined way, and also reach across all aspects of the healthcare ecosystem to bring, as you mentioned, Stacy, bring this not just acceptance, but embrace of the patient journey and the experience that occurs there, and make that a part of all kinds of decision-making and refinements as we go forward. If we're starting with the patient and learning about what did or didn't work with their journey, we're in a better place. So thank you all. I can't wait for how this evolves. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.